It's time for Forward Nation Radio. Now here he is, the host of Forward Nation Radio, David Leventhal.
Welcome to the premiere of Forward Nation Radio with David Leventhal. I am, wait for it, David Leventhal. I'm guessing that many of you have already figured that out. That's because you're probably pretty smart. How do I know that? Well, you're listening to Forward Nation Radio, so that's a good start. Thank you so much for listening to our inaugural broadcast, and for making this, we imagine, the most attended inauguration of the year. That's right, there's not a whole lot of competition there, but still, we're pretty excited to be able to imagine that we were the most attended inauguration. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, President Trump, we are all living a waking nightmare, or at least many of us are, a waking nightmare of President man-child and government controlled by a Republican Party that left decency and sanity decades in the past. Never has the need for honest news been more evident. Never has the threat to honest news been more apparent. Fake news is already running rampant. Attacks on real news are coming from the administration. Congress has already indicated that they will not investigate or publicize anything that's being done in our government that might reflect negatively upon the ruling party. As such, we need more honest news sources, and we hope to be such a source for you. We will attempt to bring you the news in a way that is honest, informative, and detailed enough to let you understand the story behind the headline so you can understand the news a little bit better and how it impacts you. We hope to do it in a way that is entertaining, sometimes funny, always provocative, so that listening to the news, becoming informed, and a responsible citizen is not a chore for you. Perhaps we consider ourselves somewhat of a hybrid between The Nation magazine or the New York Review of Books and The Daily Show. One of the things that makes us different from other news sources that you will have available to you is our lack of external bias. We are not under any corporate umbrella. We do not take advertising from corporations or political parties. In fact, we don't have any funding at all. So if you are a corporation or a political party that would like to try to tempt us into being a little less honest in our news reporting, please feel free to try. We don't think you'll succeed, but then again, if you offer us a lot of money, we'll see what happens. That doesn't mean we're not biased. We do have a bias. The show will be run with the idea so brilliantly and bravely espoused by Stephen Colbert to then President Boy George that reality has a well-known liberal bias. We believe that that is true, and the more informed you get, the more liberal you will get. We will be speaking from a liberal perspective that we come upon honestly and through the information that we've gathered over the years. As a liberal broadcaster, we are very concerned about the impact we have on others and our respect for our listeners. Yes, we will use the dreaded word politically correct. We will attempt to be politically correct because being considerate of other people's feelings is something that we think is valuable. We also will try to run this show in a way to not insult people and turn people off. We will try to avoid insulting or derogatory language and to try to promote an open dialogue rather than using terms that tend to shut off debate. So, for instance, we will try to avoid as much as possible, and it will be hard sometimes, words like moron, asshole, brain dead, because these are words that are problematic and close off debate. So, for instance, if you believe the Affordable Care Act is a good thing, But Obamacare is one of the worst tragedies imposed on the American public. We're not going to call you a moron. At least we're going to try not to call you a moron. Instead, in the hopes of promoting an open discussion, we're just going to say Trump voter. If you believe that there's no such thing as climate change because you can make a snowball in Washington, D.C. in the winter and perhaps bring it into the United States Senate, if you are, for instance, the head of the Senate Environmental Committee, we're not going to call you brain dead. We're going to call you a Trump voter. If you're someone who thinks that information only clouds whatever it is you've pulled from the deep recesses of your ass, you're a real Trump voter. If you're like me, and I know that a lot of you listening are, you're walking around in a bit of a daze right now. Walking around wondering, how is it possible that your fellow citizens have done this to us? How could they have perpetrated a tragedy of this proportion? I feel like I'm in one of the many versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Maybe I'm Donald Sutherland. I'm older, so I picked the second version. I look around and I don't know who's a real, living, thinking human being and who, in effect, is an overgrown vegetable formed from a giant seed pod from outer space. That's kind of the way I feel when I look at people and think, you are a Trump voter. How could you possibly have done this? This is a man who is singularly unqualified and unsuited to be president of the United States. If you went into outer space and threw a dart at the Earth, the person you came closest to hitting would almost certainly be more qualified to be president of the United States than President Trump. And one of the main reasons it's only probably more certain is because you might hit some other Republican leader. We've elected as president a clown. He's a clown without the big shoes. He's even got the makeup. Okay, he doesn't have the big hands either. The big gloves he doesn't have, but the makeup he's got, everything else about the clown is there. Except he's not funny. So I guess he's killer clown from who knows where, perhaps outer space. He set the bar so low that he goes and gives a speech last night and reads off the teleprompter. And the coherence of the speech becomes almost irrelevant. His approval ratings for the speech are over 50% by people who basically said, look, President Pee Wee Herman put on his big boy pants. Can I trademark that? I probably can't trademark that. In fact, it's probably trademarked by somebody else already, so I'm probably violating a trademark. So let's move on. He gives a speech like a grown-up, and we're celebrating. Don't try this at home. Imagine this. Hey, Mom, Dad, the babysitter's really learning. In another few weeks, maybe she won't drop baby Marielle on her head all the time. This is how low we've set the bar for President of the United States? This is okay? Nicholas Kristof had a provocative op-ed in the New York Times last week, calling on Trump opponents, of which he and basically every other thinking human being is, to be more considerate, less condescending, less derogatory towards Trump voters. That in the long run would be the more effective way to go for, I was going to say progressive people, but I don't want to say progressive, for sane people who want to avoid this in the future. It's an interesting question and got me into some long discussions about how we should look at what Kristof has proposed. And I guess I'd like to start exploring this a little bit by talking about the different motivations that have been advanced for Trump voters. The first one that I hear often advanced is, don't be upset with these people. Understand them. Understand that they are hurting. They are upset. They're seeing their livelihoods go out the window. They feel impotent at a world that hasn't been kind to them. I understand that, but I have two real problems with this rationale. First of all, this is the same rationale used by wife beaters. I have a problem with a justification for President Trump that also works for beating your wife. Yeah, I know, I came home and it was a rough day at work. I was getting laid off. They downsized me. I didn't feel like a real man. So of course I came home and beat the crap out of my wife. It just doesn't really work. The other problem, of course, that I have with it is a little more substantive. I do understand your concern. I do understand the plight of the white working man. That's why I'm a liberal. Because liberals actually care about the plight of the working man and actually have, are you seated, proposals to do something about it. If you are upset and impotent, try this next time. Vote for the political party that actually wants to help you. That actually wants to improve your lot in life. Not the political party that is at least somewhat responsible for your plight. I would argue primarily responsible for your plight. Okay, then you've got the Trump voters who are voting out of ignorance. You always hear that about Republican voters. They're not very well informed. Obviously, a lot of voters. Oh, they're not very well informed, so they made some bad choices when it came to voting. While I think that's always a good argument, this is President Trump, President Manchild. He didn't hide who he was. Okay, President Boy George, okay, you can understand it. They misled everybody as to what he was about and who he was, and people could say, okay, he's a nice guy, seems like a guy I'd want to have a beer with. So, sure, let's make him the president of the United States. You could see that people could be misled by a friendly face and the hope that this guy would care for them. Trump didn't even present that. To a large extent, he made perfectly clear who he was. And if he didn't, it was pretty much impossible to go through this election and not understand what Donald Trump was, what he believed in, what he believes in, perhaps, to the extent that he understands what he believes in. And the extent to which his policies were clearly not going to help the common man. Here is someone who's never shown any interest in a working man, other than perhaps having them work for him and then stiffing them when it came time to paying them. At some point, wishful thinking, bred by ignorance, is simply so counterproductive that I find it hard as someone looking from the outside to forgive someone for being this remarkably ignorant. The Republicans, in order to foster this ignorance, have created basically a faith-based narrative of alternate facts, otherwise known as lies to reasonable people, where facts don't matter. Almost 2/3 of Trump voters believe that voter fraud was rampant, despite the fact that all abundant evidence indicates that it did not exist. More than 3/4 of Trump voters believe that man does not have a role in climate change if it exists. What planet are these people living on? And at what point do you hope that someone who's willing to be this ignorant is actually going to become part of the solution? At what point do we believe that a Trump voter would actually be willing to sit down and learn from someone who has more to say. These are people for whom study after study shows when you demonstrate that something they believe is factually inaccurate, not a matter of opinion, but factually inaccurate. When they are shown that what they believe is factually inaccurate, the majority of Trump voters do not, as a thinking human being would, adjust their position accordingly. They actually double down on what they believe. In other words, when faced with facts, you choose faith. Another rationale, of course, for Trump voters, or perhaps another motivation, is anti-intellectualism. A resentment for people who are considered the educated elite. Resentment towards universities. I actually had the opportunity, not the right word, but we're being politically correct here, to spend some time with some Trump voters about a week after the election. And at one point, after finding out that I was a college professor and giving the usual sneer that indicates that I'm the enemy, I'm one of the people in the reality-based community, one of them turned to me and asked, "What's wrong with those kids in Yale?" I didn't even know originally what he was getting at. For several weeks after the election, I couldn't open a newspaper or listen to anything having to do with news. So unlike most of my life, I was not very well informed. But I really didn't know. So I'm thinking, I don't know, cell phones? They're too busy on their cell phones? They're not paying enough time thinking? I didn't know what he was getting at. What's wrong with the students from Yale? So he follows up by saying, what a bunch of whining crybabies that because of the election, they can't go take their tests and go to school? They can't take their midterms? I said, well, I haven't heard about this. I know it's pretty close to the end of the semester, so I'm pretty well guessing they're not missing their midterms, which probably happened a month ago. But what could be happening with those Yale students? Maybe they're informed. Maybe they're thoughtful. Maybe unlike you, they actually have a sense of the magnitude of what you have just done. I didn't actually say that because it was a kid's party and I didn't want to get my kid thrown out of a birthday party. But that's what I'm thinking. That people just dismiss people who may know more than them, may be better informed, and revel in their ignorance. There is, I have found in many cases, a resentment towards me as being better informed. I hear from people, I read in the news, even Nicholas Kristof, liberals shouldn't look down on Trump voters. And he has some instances, of course, where they did. Okay, so that's a good argument. Of course, most people just say that and assume that liberals are looking down on Trump voters. The resentment, in fact, is coming from the other direction. Someone has to explain to me how people who are irresponsible and not doing their job as citizens in a democracy, making choices as bad as the choices that were just made in this country, can resent people who are doing better, who are taking their obligations as citizens in a democratic society seriously. I'm not supposed to resent them for constantly getting in the way, for stopping progress, but it's okay for them, I'm sure for most people it's not okay, but still it's going to happen, to resent people who are doing better. I have actually gotten resentment for the fact that I drive a hybrid car from people who've made the decision to drive huge pickup trucks and huge SUVs. I understand that they probably think that I resent them and look down on them. Because I do. Because I do. Not people who need these vehicles, of course, but people who want them because they come with the big metal balls hanging from the back. I do resent the antisocial decisions that they've made. But I don't say these things. They assume the resentment. And I hear resentment from them. Those people in hybrid cars, they think they're better. They're always getting in our way. And I'm sitting listening to people who are less socially responsible resent people who are more socially responsible. I'm not sure in the long run what reaching out to these people is going to do. They resent the fact that I resent them before I indicate in any way that I resent them. If I try to indicate that I resent them, presumably that I don't resent them, that will presumably just be another fact that they're going to ignore because they know deep down that I really do resent them. Okay, in that case, they'd be right. So that's probably not the best example of that one. But still, you probably get the point. Another thing that I find interesting as a motivation for Trump voters is fear. Which is really funny coming from a political party that's so concerned with how big their balls are, including the metal ones hanging from the back of their pickup trucks. And yet, if you look at what's motivating so many Republican voters, it's fear. The terrorists are coming to kill us all. And then the gays are going to rape my dead body. The gays are coming for my daughter. She wanted to grow up and get married and never have sex except for procreation. And then the gays got their hooks into her. They did that thing they do with their eyes or whatever, and they turned her gay. Don't even start with transgendered individuals and the fear that that instills in people. Oh my God, they're different. They're not like me. That's scary. What about refugees? How come pretty much every other civilized nation in the world is brave enough to accept Syrian children, let's say, into their homes? But not many of the Trump voters. Oh no, that 3-year-old Syrian child is going to grow up to hate me and hurt me. Oh no. Then there are the immigrants. Oh no, the immigrants are coming. It's not just that they're going to take my job. That at least is a rational fear. God forbid one of them might marry my daughter. Oh no. Things might change? Something different than what I was used to? It's not the 1950s anymore? Oh no. Donald Trump shouldn't have promised them to build a wall. He should have promised them to knit a blanket that they could cower under. Because of the extent to which fear is such a motivator on the right that might blind them to compassionate choices. I guess maybe people who voted for Donald Trump out of fear, maybe some of them can be appealed to. Maybe some of them can be picked off for the next election to vote for the more rational choice, the better choice, the choice that will promote Americans' interests. But I don't get the sense that there's a whole lot of openness there. Again, it's President Manchild. He didn't sneak up on anybody. He's so obviously unqualified that it's hard to imagine that reasoned discourse is going to assuage these people's fears. And finally, of course, we've got the big elephant in the closet, bigotry. Hillary Clinton got in a lot of hot water when, during the campaign, she pointed out that 50%, half of Trump supporters, were bigots of one form or another. And there was a lot of blowback about that. How could Hillary say something so demeaning of Trump voters? I think that was a comment even raised in Nicholas Kristof's op-ed. You shouldn't say stuff like that to be so demeaning of people. Really? They're bigots. We're supposed to treat them well? We're supposed to welcome them? I don't buy that. If you're a bigot, you need to be marginalized, not catered to. Now, I understand that bigotry is a long continuum. Some people are outright bigots. Some people, maybe a little bit of bias. I think most of us have a certain amount of bias and fall somewhere on this spectrum. A little bit of bias influences what we're doing. Now, maybe some of the people who aren't that bigoted, maybe some of them can be appealed to. Maybe some of them are close to getting to the point where they're willing to accept the fact that their wives and daughters can vote. Maybe some of them will even come around to thinking that it's a good thing that men can no longer legally rape their wives as their property in America. Something that was not true just a few decades ago during my lifetime. Maybe eventually they'll come around a little bit and you could peel some of these people off. But it still seems kind of strange to make generous, thoughtful, considerate appeals to people who are outright bigots. Hillary Clinton said 50%. She got in a lot of hot water for that. People said, no, the number's not 50%. It's only 45%. Perhaps my own view is that it's a hell of a lot more than 50%. That many of the people who wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman, or want immigrants kicked out of this country because they're brown-skinned, wouldn't admit to these things, but fall somewhere on the scale of bigotry. My bet would be that most Trump voters have bigotry as a large motive. How could Hillary say something like that about Trump voters? Don't we know that she is just alienating people who might otherwise be convinced to vote for her? Well, wait a minute. Let's back up for a second. Who was it who said that he could take out a gun and shoot somebody in the middle of a busy Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose a single voter? I'm sorry, is that respectful of his voters? That, of course, is what President Manchild said. He could take out a gun on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody in public and he wouldn't lose any votes. And yet somehow this did not become the huge media sensation. Oh, that liberal media. Did not become the huge media sensation that Hillary Clinton's absolutely reasonable comment was. Again, maybe it wasn't 50%, you can quibble. But the general comment that many of Trump's voters were motivated by bigotry and are bigots is really unassailable. Is really straightforward. You know, several years ago, The Daily Show had a funny episode about Republicans in Congress. I forget what it was, what the subject was, but they were doing something incredibly stupid and incredibly hurtful. And the point of the skit was one of the correspondents sat there with a shirt that said, "I'm with stupid," and the other one sat there with a shirt that said, "I'm with evil." And they debated whether the Republican Party was stupid or evil. And ultimately, of course, the point of the segment was they're clearly both. I don't know how we reach out to evil. I guess reaching out to stupid, at least among the voters, may be more plausible. But a lot of me thinks the answer to Trump voters is probably not to reach out to them. The answer is probably to marginalize them, to make them basically irrelevant somehow. Because I just don't see people at this point who voted for Donald Trump becoming productive members of society anytime in the near future. This is such a level of irresponsibility or evil that it's just hard to imagine that these people are going to be helpful in the future. Shortly after the election, the question in all the media was, what do you do for the holidays? What do you do with family members and friends who are Trump voters who are coming over for the holidays? Well, the holidays are gone, but the question lingers on. How does one interact with Trump voters? As far as friends, that's easy. Find new friends. Okay, that's a little harsh. I'll admit maybe that's a little harsh. I think generally that's what you should try to do. Find new friends. But okay, I know Trump voters who are nice people, at least outwardly nice people. The ones who maybe fall in the ignorance category didn't mean the kind of harm that they've done. And I can interact with these people in a friendly manner. But I guess compartmentalization becomes important at this point. I need to be able to compartmentalize my friends. I play football with a group of people. Is it likely that some of them are Trump voters? Yeah. I used to play softball with a lot of people I'm willing to bet are Trump voters. I don't want to give up football. I can interact with them on the football field. I could have fun. I could be friendly. But they're not coming over to my house for game night. They're not coming over for political discussion. I generally don't want to deal with it. I want to hang out with a better crowd. Sorry. What about family members who voted for Trump? Your weird bigoted uncle who comes over for Christmas dinner. The scuttlebutt seemed to be, or the conventional wisdom was, you should be welcoming to your family members who are Trump supporters and avoid political discussion to avoid contentiousness. As a general proposition, well, I'm involved in this radio show. I don't believe that not talking about politics is a solution. I believe that not talking about politics is what got us into this mess. I believe that one of the ways you deal with bigoted Uncle Charlie at the end of the table is you talk politics all the time. And you make it clear to him that you don't respect his bigoted views and that you are informed enough to actually contradict them. Will he listen to anything you say? Probably not. He knows what he knows. He's always known it since he was 3, and there's no reason why information should change that. But maybe some of your relatives will be influenced. Maybe Uncle Charlie's children, who haven't yet boxed themselves into that right-wing corner, will start to see some reason. We'll see some light. We'll reject the message coming from their father. Have political discussions with your family members. The ones who you can't talk to at all, try not to invite them. If you're in a position where your parents are on the wrong side of this, the future of the country, here's a suggestion for mom and dad. Mom, Dad, I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed. You've probably heard that from them a few times. Maybe you want to throw it back at them. Mom, Dad, this country has a lot of important things it needs to do. You really need to kind of get on board. I'm disappointed. So what are my recommendations for holiday dinners or for interactions with friends and family members who are Trump supporters? I have a few. First of all, don't put food out. If you feed them, they come back. So try not to put food out. Second, and this is actually something that they should appreciate, don't let them make any decisions. They've clearly evidenced that the most simple decisions in the world are way too complicated for them and must cause them an untold amount of angst. So make decisions for them. You know, make believe they're Chris Christie at the White House. He'll have the meatloaf. He looks like a meatloaf eating kind of guy, and I don't want to burden him with the difficult decision that other people here are facing about what to order for dinner. Finally, and I think most importantly, under no circumstances should you have sex with one of them. Sex sometimes leads to procreation. Pretty soon, mistakes may be unfixable. If your husband is a Trump supporter and you're not, try not having sex with him for 4 years. Actually, you've probably already tried that. That's probably why he's a Trump supporter. Maybe I should have put that in my list of things that make people Trump supporters. Lack of sex for a very long time. So no sex. Maybe eventually they'll come around, and in any event, you'll avoid further entanglements. Several years ago, you'll find out how many years in a few moments, I had a student come up to me before class to share a story with me. This was a student who was taking me for the third class. He was taking me for the third time, but I'm a little concerned that if I say that, it sounds like it's because he did badly. He took me for 3 separate classes. And at one point in our third course together, he comes up to me before class and says, I have a funny story for you, Professor Leventhal. I have to share this with you. So, okay, share this with me. He says, okay, I'm walking on campus, and I'm walking with a friend of mine. And I say to her, who are you voting for president? Who are you voting for president? I thought it would start a conversation because I didn't think she was particularly informed or politically active or interested. So I was really surprised by the vehemence of her response. I don't know if vehemence was his word. It's certainly my word. I was really surprised by the vehemence of her response. She said, oh my God, not John Kerry. So now you know how long ago this conversation was. I was teaching at 12 years old at the time, I think. She says, not John Kerry. So he says, mindful of the last class I took with you, I kind of smiled on the inside and I said to her, really? What's a liberal? Now, the last class he had taken with me, the second class he took with me, was a class called Critical Thinking. And one of the things we talk about in that class extensively is the fact that words are used beyond their meaning. That the very nature of certain words, maybe because of their ambiguity, because of the connotation they have, predispose people to either liking or not liking whatever it is you're proposing. In other words, the word, the term becomes more important than the message. I guess thinking about it now, it's like an argument against cursing, where people might get more hung up on the fact that you said shit than what you meant by it. That would be in a negative way. Usually, of course, it's used in a positive way to promote your message. And one of the words I talk about is the word liberal. And I ask my students to define the word liberal. And they bring in all these definitions, most of which have a very positive connotation. Generous, open-minded, considerate, in favor of opportunity, community. And I point out that so many of these words that are used synonymously or to define liberal are very positive sounding words. And yet in America, liberal is a negative word. It's a negative sounding word. And I say in class that people use the word liberal like they use the word asshole. You don't know what it means, but you know that it's bad. You're a liberal. Well, what do you mean by that? I'm generous. I'm considerate. I'm open-minded. I'm tolerant. You don't get into the weeds. You just hear you're a liberal, and that's a negative. So, continuing with the story, he says to me, so I said to her, are you going to vote for John Kerry? And she says, or who are you going to vote for? And she says, not John Kerry. And I said, really? Why not John Kerry? And she responds by saying, he's a liberal. Now, at this point, he smiles at me and says, you know, with your class in mind. I then followed up by saying, really? What's a liberal? And her response was, and this is a true story, unless he made it up. I'm not making it up. Her response was, I don't know, but I know I don't like it. So what is a liberal? Since I've used the term a couple times already, and I've described myself and the people involved in this show as liberals, probably a good idea to define the way I'm using it. Well, in our society, as I indicated, liberal can mean many different things. In an economic sense, a liberal is someone who believes in a more active role for government in our economic system. A liberal is more likely to believe in government regulations, pollution regulations, worker safety regulations, regulations limiting your ability to sell a product that's going to harm people. A conservative is someone who believes in less of a role for government. There is always a gray area on every issue where liberals and conservatives can both have good arguments. So in other words, a liberal might believe in more stringent regulations to battle climate change. A conservative may very reasonably and principally argue that some of those regulations go too far and for more relaxed regulations. Unfortunately, this country has moved so far to the right over the years, that is, towards conservatism, towards the pure laissez-faire capitalism end of the spectrum, and away from the socialist or communist end of the spectrum. We've moved so far to the right that the response from conservatives in our government right now isn't, I think your regulations go a little too far, and here are more reasonable, lesser regulations to battle climate change. They just deny the facts and say climate change doesn't exist. Wherever one falls on the ideological spectrum, more liberal, more conservative, there's always a gray area where people can have better arguments than others. As a liberal, for instance, by my nature, I can't make a decision. I think that's kind of a hallmark of liberalism too, that you're informed, thoughtful, and that makes making decisions somewhat more difficult. And yet, as you've already heard in the first few minutes of this show, I have some pretty strong opinions for someone who has a problem making decisions and who understands that there is a gray area on which reasonable people can differ on every issue. So how do I square that circle? I can't make a decision between two choices in the gray area. When my wife and I get together in the afternoon and say, what do you want to do for dinner? You want to bring in Mexican? You want to bring in Chinese? I don't know. It's a hard choice. Mexican, Chinese, burrito, vegetables. I don't know. Tough choice. So I probably bring in both and overeat. But if you say to me, what do you want for dinner? Mexican, Chinese, or dog shit? I can be pretty confident that I don't want the dog shit. And that's why, contrary to much of what liberals believe, I will frequently appear so certain of myself during this show. But in any event, what everyone feels about our shift to the right over time in this country, certainly since Ronald Reagan, the bottom line, what that means is, with less government regulation, the burden of protecting yourself and making good decisions shifts from the government to you. You are expected to be informed. Take that, Trump voter. You're expected to be informed enough to make good decisions, to know which products are going to harm you, because the FDA, the Agricultural Department, whichever regulatory agency, hopefully that will still be existing in a few years, as they're not being as stringent in their enforcement as they had been. So the burden shifts from government to you. I tell my students that I'm a liberal in large part because I'm lazy. And while I started saying that as a joke, it dawned on me after a while that that was actually really true. Before I go buy a pack of gum at CVS, I don't want to research gum on the internet for 2 hours to make sure the gum's not going to kill me. I'm willing to spend a few dollars to pay somebody to do it for me, to make sure that any gum being sold at CVS or anywhere else, CVS is not a sponsor, that any gum being sold is not going to harm me, meets certain levels of product safety and quality, that the toys I give to my children are not going to stunt their intellectual development because we've lessened the regulations regarding lead content of toys. I'm a liberal because I'm willing to pay somebody else to do it so I don't have to. So I know when I walk to a water fountain, I can drink out of it and I'm not poisoning myself. Nowadays, I don't have such reason to know that. Anyway, that's in the economic sense what a liberal is versus a conservative. On social issues, the roles are basically reversed. And liberals tend to believe in less of a role for government in our social, cultural environment. There are a lot of young people who are pretty liberal, in part because they figure liberals are more likely to relax drug laws or eliminate drug laws. Liberals are more likely to accept greater change in social issues, more tolerant of people whose behavior we used to frown upon, homosexuals, transgender, whatnot. And so the roles reverse in the social sphere, that conservatives are more likely to believe in a bigger role for government, banning abortion. Perhaps, given 2 Supreme Court picks, banning contraceptives. Those are, to some extent, I would argue, almost passé in how they describe the difference between a liberal and a conservative. They're from the textbooks, but I'm not sure that they're the best description of the difference between a liberal and a conservative, at least in the real world today. What is one difference between a liberal and a conservative? Do you tend to believe government should be engaging in policies to benefit the rich? Or do you believe that government should be engaged in policies that benefit other people? The poor, the workers. In fact, a distinction between liberals and conservatives in our government, and by that I generally mean Democrats and Republicans, although they're not completely monolithic that way. Do you support the interests of owners, or do you support the interests of workers? Which makes the fact that the angry white, formerly worker, is actually voting Republican. We refer to as capital versus labor in the input of our economic system. Do you favor the people who make their money through their money, or do you favor the people who work for a living? Look at what's coming out already from the Republican government. Oil subsidies are fine. Now that's government interference in the free market. We shouldn't be subsidizing oil exploration, but Republicans tend to be okay with that. There are some principled conservatives who are against even government largesse towards the wealthy, but for the most part, the Republican Party is perfectly happy with government largesse towards the wealthy. It's just everybody else they have a problem with largesse towards. Children who might want to eat or have a safe and quality education, that may be more of a problem. But giving money to oil companies is fine. Look what the Trump administration just did a day or two ago. Coal companies no longer have to clean up their own messes. Inspiring my children. Mom, Dad, if coal companies don't have to clean up after themselves, why do I? No, they haven't really caught on to that one yet, but it's coming, I'm sure. They're still a little too young for that. Coal companies don't need to clean up their messes anymore. They should just be able to dump their waste, their, in many cases, toxic waste, to dam up rivers, dam up streams, and harm other people without being responsible for it. What else did the Trump administration already do? Well, Obama had instituted policies to open up courts of law to people who've been harmed by corporations, but who face the fact that corporations have learned to stick into the fine print of contracts arbitration clauses that prevent you from going into court, from taking them to court. The Obama administration finally acted to limit corporations' ability to do that, to prevent people from going to court. The Republicans have just taken that away. Minimum wage. Certainly you can forget about a minimum wage increase over the next 4 years. Why? A minimum wage increase shifts money and resources from owners to workers. Owners have figured out how to increase their profits dramatically with tremendously rising income inequality by making their workers work for less. Deregulation as a whole, part and parcel of the Republican agenda, is about promoting the interests of the owners of businesses over the people who are actually affected by the actions of businesses. Another real-world difference between a conservative and a liberal is reason versus ideology. The Oxford Dictionary called post-truth the word of the year. Post-truth. As in, we are in a society where truth doesn't matter. What you want to believe is all that matters. Liberals are people who believe in letting facts cloud our judgment. Conservatives are more likely to be people who believe that they know what they know and they don't need information to change their minds. Who put faith above facts. Leading to the remarkable irony that who in America is most like many of the Muslim extremists we're fighting? Who's most like the Taliban? The Republican Party in America. who's really upset about the fictional institution of Sharia law in America because it might interfere with their efforts to install Christian law throughout America. Not to promote reason over faith, but to promote their own faith over a faith they don't like. The similarities are remarkable. After we were attacked by religious fanatics and extremists and anti-intellectuals, people who put faith above facts, we could have responded by saying, this is the age of reason. And this is how thoughtfulness and facts and reality need to be part of everybody's discussion. But we didn't do that because we had President Boy George. And religious extremists are the Republican base. That and rich people, as he pointed out. Finally, in the real world, what distinguishes between a liberal and a conservative? I would argue that liberals are people who find it much easier to have empathy for others. This came to me when many years ago I bought my first hybrid car. It just so happened that I needed a new car the first year that hybrid cars were available in America. And I bought a hybrid car. And I remember that several of my conservative friends said to me, you made a bad decision. You're never going to make your money back on gas savings. In other words, you pay a premium for a hybrid car. You save some money on gas, but you pay a premium for a hybrid car. And I remember thinking, no wonder we have a hard time talking to each other. We live in different universes. You say that I'm not going to make my money back on my car. I made a bad decision. And I say, I didn't make this decision selfishly. I made this decision because it was the right thing to do, and I'm fortunate enough to be in a financial position where I can actually act upon my values and my belief in what's best for society. I can make very minor sacrifices for the good of the planet. And I think there was a complete lack of understanding that people would behave that way. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration in some cases, but that is the reaction I got from people. Look at what's going on right now with a 17-year-old boy who is transgender and whose case is coming in front of the United States Supreme Court. What kind of people could want to make this kid's life more difficult? Have you no empathy? Have you no compassion? Have you no decency and consideration for others? And the list goes on from there. We're getting near the end, so I'm going to start to wrap it up right now. What do I think we should do? Where do we go from here? I think fight, fight, fight. It'll probably mostly give the other side enjoyment, but it may make some changes. It may pull some people who are more reasonable people onto your side. It may at least give the Democratic Party more backbone to fight for what's important. Marginalize the people who've created this disaster for this country and the world. Make them not matter. Maybe eventually they'll come along. I hope so. In the meantime, I will continue to promote policies that benefit them, whether they like it or not. But fight for what you have. Talk to your reasonable friends. Make sure they speak. They stay informed. There's a plug for our show. Make sure people listen to Forward Nation Radio and stay informed. Engage in political discussions and get out and vote. The other side is making it very difficult for many of you to do that. So you're going to have to fight harder and make sure you do that so a minority of Americans are no longer in a position to undermine this country and the planet itself. Okay, I guess I'm going to have to wrap it up at this point. I'm getting motions from my producer. Not sure what they mean. I'm new at this, but I'm pretty sure they're saying wrap it up right now. I would like to very briefly thank, since this is our first broadcast, thank the team. starting with my producer, Damian Hardeen, a true Renaissance man who took this show from concept to execution, who is our photographer, musician, recorded the theme music, team leader, and assembled an outstanding team, including Julia Adamo, our Director of Research and Development, Carolyn Balcom, graphic design and resident artist. When you look at our website, you will see their handiwork. Nicholas Burrell, our Director of Operations, and the guy who taught me which end of the microphone to spit onto. He didn't tell me to stay far enough away that my nose doesn't hit the microphone, but he's new at this, I guess, too. Rafi Cooper, street team, blogger, research assistant, and our announcer, Mario Brito. Like looking forward? Go to forwardnation.com. That's forwardnationradio.com. And get the full experience. You'll see the video from this and every episode there and on our own YouTube channel as well. Be sure to check out the video broadcast of this show on the Forward Nation Radio YouTube channel or at forwardnationradio.com. Like us on Facebook and share some much-needed political sanity. You can also tune in to Forward Nation Radio on Podbeam at podbean.com. Tell your friends, spread the word, Forward Nation Radio. Happy birthday, Stephanie and Brian, and we are out. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to Forward Nation Radio with David Leventhal.